perception, mental picture of what a mother is. If you're a child, you have one picture. If you're an angry teenager, you'll have another picture. If you're a very spiritual priest, you would have another picture of what mom is. Your version of mother depends on you, on your context. Yeah. Even, I won't say even worse, but even more so, take a specific event that we all witness. In this case, let's say a SWAT team getting out of cars and going somewhere. Every single one of us will have a different perception of that. Some people may say, oh, wow, that's cool. Look at those people with guns. Some people, they might just freak out. Like, that's so horrible. And other people might just be confused what's going on. Every single one of us will have a different perception and a different internalization of what that means. And that's because we have all these filters. Filters have to do with age and your upbringing, your culture, your education, all those sorts of things. So, phenomenology kind of came down to this one point, that every event or word or experience, everything in your past is a filter that affects your perception in the here and now. So, and the next piece, which is very foundational, is your truth, the thing that you experience, the thing that you perceive, it's unique and it's valuable and valid, equally valid. Everybody's perception is equally valid because, who's to say which one's right or wrong? We all have these perceptions through our filters. So, their idea is, this idea that there's an objective truth. This is a myth. That is not true. Every individual has their own truth. They hold their own truth within each of them, and it's valid. Everybody's context is different. We have to acknowledge that. Everyone's experiences and filters are very real. So, everyone has within them something that makes their own truth. And they've also said, phenomenologists, that what our primary task is to let's figure out how to uncover where these truths come from by unpacking everybody's perceptions, everybody's filters, and trying to get there. Well, so that's what this says. Our goal should not be pursuing truth. It should be deconstructing all these filters, analyzing everyone's experience, and hopefully at some point we can figure out how to reconcile all of this. But the most important thing is everybody has a truth, and everybody's truth is valid. So, comment here now about it's the ascendance of subjectivity, and it's also the decline of objectivity. So now, in this new world, the event that occurred, or maybe a message that I've given to somebody, it's not nearly as important as who gave the message and the actual receiver or the observer. So, for instance, what is said doesn't really matter as much as who said it and the person who actually receives the message. So, and a perfect example is if a person of color and a person of, say, a white person make the very same comment, the fact is that it's not the content of the comment that matters. It's who said it and who they said it to and their perception. And as a result, there will be very different judgments placed on that same comment. So statements are no longer judged by their truthfulness, but they're judged by who said them and how they land on the perceiver. And similarly, statements made from a position of privilege are not valid if they're made to a person of non-privilege. And that's just, again, because of this nature of perception now being truth. Derrida even took it one step further. And he said, basically, here's the biggest problem is, in all of this, is that Western culture itself is systemically biased and discriminatory. We have Greek and Judeo-Christian thought and the obsession with truth, things like logic and rationality, and then all the other associated things that came along with that: science, physics, math, law, democracy, economics. All those other things are based on this Western conception of truth and cause and effect and logic. His idea is all of those things have basically been discriminatory towards those who didn't participate in Western culture. And we need to deconstruct those things. We need to do away with those things so that we can actually get to the heart of the truth of diverse experience across many cultures. Very interesting phenomenon, or a very interesting school of thought. And what came along as a result of that was something that I don't think I understand, and I don't think many people understand just yet. But somehow, this particular train of thought and this particular school of thought just spread like wildfire throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s in higher education. There were critical theorists like Marcuse, and if you ever see the word critical, you will know critical actually came from this. Critical studies, for instance, critical race theory, critical Asian studies, critical feminist theory, critical gender theory. It came from this school of thought. Back in the 1950s, if you went to a university, you would not find any of those kinds of faculties. If you go to any university now, you will find them all. There's a huge explosion of academia in this area. And as well, it's now permeated into real life. This is where people talk about woke, and this is where woke came from. It came from basically this school of thought, deconstructionism, and now what we'd call postmodernism, but it's critical studies related to this idea of we need to deconstruct Western thought, the pursuit of truth, objective truth, and the use of logic and rational tools to find that truth. We need to deconstruct that. So, I've said a lot there. Are there any questions, any things that kind of didn't make sense to you? I'm not sure it made sense to me, but that's... So, as a result of that, this is this idea of, okay, woke. What is woke? Well, to be woke is to be awakened to the realization that your experiences and truth are different from others. Their experiences and truth are equally valid to yours and deserve same recognition. Your background, if it's more attuned to traditional Western values and civilization, has given you unfair advantages. And those advantages are your privilege. They're part of their genetic, meaning that they come with you as being part of your upbringing and your heritage, and you're born with those advantages. And so they're systemic. And you need to recognize that. So your obligations as a privileged person are to understand those privileges and your role, maybe even in kind of systemically sustaining and furthering those privileges. Understand your biases, conscious and unconscious, towards those of less privilege, and then address your privilege by trying to remove all those biases, educating others, removing all structural and systemic impediments that privilege some but not others, for instance, government systems based on colonialism, like maybe even democracy, judicial systems, educational system, etc., and reconciling with and compensating those who've been unfairly treated. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of what woke is. Of course, this is kind of my cobbled together definition. I suspect most of you, if not all of you, have encountered this in some form or another, and basically the phenomenon that is out there right now. And yeah, so, do you have any questions or comments about that? Let me just. No? Good. It's all clear? It's all good? Yeah. It's like, that's no big thing. I know that. I do notice, though, it's 8 o'clock right now, and the next section, we are going to go into a lot of stuff, and I'm just going to kind of throw out a whole bunch of observations at you, and you'll have to take it. So rather than start on that, grab yourself a bite or a drink, and then we'll get started back up in another 5 minutes. just going to call everybody back to their seat, and we'll get started in a minute or two. Okay, everyone, going to get started. So I just want to, right now, like I say, I'm just going to fire a whole bunch of stuff at you, and hopefully you can absorb it all. What they are is basic observations of how we've seen this particular philosophy of deconstructionism, postmodernism, wokeism, critical theoryism, whatever you want to call it, and what we've observed over the last 10 years or so, how it's manifested itself in our society. So, number one, trends in deconstructionism. This is not exactly the same, but it's definitely taken off as a result of deconstructionism. And this idea that every individual has their own truth. These truths have been historically suppressed by the existing structures of power, whether it be government or patriarchy. Patriarchy meaning, this male-dominated type of society. Racism, corporations, etc. The only way to overcome this suppression is by individuals proclaiming their own suppressed truth. And so make sure that if your truth narrative gets out there and you sell it and you advertise it and publish it and proclaim it. And so there's this idea that we need to get our truth out there. And we need to make sure that it gets covered. Social media, marches, news protests, truth to power, that is something that we see quite often as well. There's another phenomenon. Like I say, these are just kind of symptoms, if you will, of this overall deconstruction movement, but victimhood and hashtag Me Too. So I apologize, this slide I put together, 3 years ago when hashtag Me Too was a big thing. But it's still sort of a thing. And the idea here, though, is that every event that occurs, and you call it a negative event, has at least one perpetrator and one victim. And the idea here is you are a victim if you perceive yourself to be a victim. That's your truth, and it's valid. So, as a victim, and as a victim with that truth that you are a victim, you should be entitled to justice. That is just, plain and simple logic once you get to this idea that, yes, in truth, you are a victim. So, this idea, too, that, discrimination or harassment, abuse, those sorts of things are actually, they are a subjective truth. They are true if you feel that way, that you have been harassed. And it actually doesn't necessarily matter at what point you realize that you're a victim. You were and are a victim whenever you realize it. So we see many, many stories in this regard coming out. Now, I'm not going to necessarily make a value judgment one way or the other. I feel like every one of these cases is actually one of those cases that you should, take seriously and understand. At the same time, there is kind of this default perspective that if somebody feels like a victim, they're correct, and justice needs to be served without really an assessment of the other side's story. And that is kind of the way things have tilted now. It's tilted towards, the scales of justice has tilted towards those who would be claiming victimhood as opposed to this idea of innocent until proven guilty. Here's another phenomenon, false facts and the media. It's impossible for events to be reported objectively, and why would you anyhow? Because objective truth is not really what we're striving for anymore. So make sure instead that, if you're a media person, if you're a social influencer, or whatever you are, you just need to make sure your narrative gets out there, because your narrative is what sells. So media companies, influencers, et cetera, they get their revenue based on views and subscribers. So naturally, they are going to really focus on what gets the most of those views and subscribers. Things like outrage or tragedy or injustice or fear. Here's some examples. If you can produce outrage, like anytime you can put a story out about Donald Trump, you can get a lot of views on that. So do it. And there's a victimized people or disadvantaged in COVID. This again, 3-year-old slide. But the idea here is, we're not trying anymore to portray what actually happened in sort of an unbiased, objective light. What we are trying to do now is get a narrative out there that sells. That's the most important thing, not truth. So we get a lot of this divisive, polarizing stuff out there, published in the media. And frankly, the idea that we get objective reporting on anything now, very, very hard to come by. So I'm going to wade into this one a little bit, but just for purposes of explanation. But the fact is the whole idea of gender identification. This is not LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual. This is now into the T realm, trans, and beyond. And the idea that, when we're talking about gender, for a postmodern person, let's face it, gender is not a reality. Gender is a social construct. There's a construct that was developed by the Western civilization. It's a label. It's based on traditional and Judeo-Christian norms. As a confining structure, it needs to be dismantled, and instead, we need to put in place something that's more descriptive of human experience. And the idea here is that individuals should now be allowed to label themselves with whatever they feel applies to them, whatever they identify with. And society needs to now recognize a person on that basis of how they identify. And I will say that this is a fundamental departure too from the original LBG movement, which was much more about a freedom to love who you like. And now we're into this idea of, you have freedom to be whatever you want to be, whatever you choose to be or identify with. Of course, like I say, that's a departure, and it's led to some serious tensions, and we've seen that already with traditional liberals or secular humanists, as questions are, okay, well, what exactly is a woman? Who is a woman? What does it mean to be female? Is it really somebody just identifies with that, or is there some other objective element to it that you can, and so there's been back and forth, and it's been, as we know, a fairly significant debate that still rages on. People who you'd consider to be traditional liberals. In fact, I've got on here J.K. Rowling. She is a Christian, a nominal Christian, but John Cleese is not. Margaret Atwood is not. These are not Christians. These are people who are basically atheists, or very close to at least atheists, and they're standing up and saying this is ridiculous. I could have put Martina Navratilova in there. They're standing up and saying, well, no, there's a biological basis. And of course, this idea that biology, which is, objective truth, needs to stand in the way of my subjective truth, which is how I identify. That's caused, a huge amount of conflict within the liberal community. And again, this is the tension here now between what we would say are the new liberals or the new left or the radical left and the traditional secular humanist liberals like these folks here. There's actually a huge tension. And that's because these folks, J.K. Rowling, John Cleese, they still believe in objective truth. They believe that, there's a science, objective, foundational truth to everything, and we need to cling to that. Of course, in deconstruction, that assumption is not there. Okay, this one's pretty dense, sorry. Wade into another one, critical race theory, which you may or may not have heard of. It's huge, though, especially in the States, and it's basically embodied in the Black Lives Matter movement. But again, they start with the premise: North America, Europe, product of Western civilization and its government and rule of law, religions. So Richard Delgado, who's the actual founder or co-founder of critical race theory, basically said critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the principles of constitutional law. So basically, underneath critical race theory is this idea that all of these things, the foundations of Western civilization, they're wrong. They're discriminatory, they're biased, they need to be discarded. And of course, what they would say is non-Western minorities have been subjugated by these structures and oppressed by them. And they would point to evidence, there's lower levels of income and education and higher levels of crime within these communities. That is evidence of the fact that these Western structures have oppressed them and subjugated them. So, in critical race theory, the idea is, again, you have to dismantle all of these systems of power and oppression, starting with the justice and legal law enforcement system, things like defund the police, things like reformative justice and those sorts of things where, it's not a penal justice system anymore, it's something else. Economics, education, political system, all of those things need to be completely dismantled. Rightfully restoring the oppressed to their position of where they rightfully belong, which is equal holders of power, if not more so. So, again, this is very much a departure from what secular humanists just, 20, 30 years earlier would have said. Secular humanists would have said back in 1980, for instance, in 1990, we should strive to be colorblind. And that's secular humanism. In 2020, of course, it's no, that is absolutely wrong. Colors need to be recognized, and those who are people of color, or non-privileged color, I should say, must be compensated by those who are of the privileged color. And That's what critical race theory would say. So, yeah, I've got some old school quotes from people like Morgan Freeman, who said the best way to get rid of racism is to stop talking about it. Michael Jackson, doesn't matter if you're black or white. Oprah Winfrey, I was raised to believe that excellence is the best deterrent to racism or sexism. And then Thomas Sowell, he said, he's a black humanist and very famous economist. He said, if you've always believed that everyone should play by the same rules and be judged by the same standards, that would have gotten you labeled as a radical 60 years ago, and a liberal 30 years ago, and a racist today. And he's one of those people who agrees with this. So yeah, again, tension. Colonialism. This is fairly similar in a lot of ways to critical race theory, and that's why the slide looks very similar. This idea that North America and Europe is, again, the product of Western civilization, Westerners who came over and basically took over all of North America and established the government, rule of law, all those sorts of things in keeping with Western civilization, and the idea, again, that minorities have been, and including the natives of the land, were subjugated and oppressed by these structures. It's slightly different than, say, Black Lives Matter, because it's not so much about revolution and dismantling everything as it is about reconciliation. And in this case, there's the movement here in Canada in particular, but also in the States, is not about dismantling everything, but rather recognizing all of the historical wrongs and sort of linking them to present day and how can we remediate that. So for instance, the taking of territory. Well, first we need to acknowledge the taking of territory, and of course we have territorial acknowledgements almost everywhere we go now in public speech. But the fact is too, there now needs to be something else done, compensation. Now that you've acknowledged it, there's more that needs to be done, and so compensation needs to occur. The idea that there was a destruction of a culture and a way of life, residential schools, some people refer to that as a genocide even. Physical and mental and sexual abuses, present day economic, physical, and emotional hardships within the Indigenous community. Those things are, again, indicators of just how subjugated they have been. And so the idea is we need to dismantle the things that are still oppressive. And basically, a lot of this is just going back to history and saying all of those things were wrong. Compensation should be made now. We rewrite history too with more Indigenous-friendly narratives, and now we need to all as well celebrate all of those things that were subjugated, whether it be Indigenous culture or art or folklore, or language, those sorts of things. And the idea being ultimately reconciliation occurs through this kind of remediation and compensation for all the historical wrongs. So, again, a symptom of colonialism. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. You guys have probably heard of that in some form or another. And again, it goes back to the existing structures in Western civilization. They're a product of basically Western or white males. And I think it can be, this is the idea, it can be assumed that these structures naturally and implicitly favor these Western or white males. So, society, spelled that wrong. Yeah.
I think it's important to note that recently they've included Asians in the privileged class here, so
That's right. Wow. I can't believe you just said that about us. We're the oppressed ones. Yeah, hopefully we got that. Well, and it's very interesting. So, so for instance, in the United States, and this is one example, the idea that, for instance, Ivy League admissions, and you have to write SATs, and you have to write, in some of these cases, stringent entrance exams to get into some of these prestigious schools. And over the past 10 years or so, people have done some comparisons, and they've done a little bit of investigation, and they've seen just how significantly Asians are actually rejected. Their applications are rejected, in spite of the fact that, in general, their scores are much higher. Yeah. And in other words, there's clearly, call it affirmative action, or some sort of compensating mechanism that's going on there, that's admitting people from other races who are perhaps less able to perform academically on the tests, but are more in keeping with some idea that we need to be compensating, we need to be helping these people. So you're absolutely right. In basically in present day terms, Asians actually are viewed as being a bit of a privileged class, and for whatever reason, there's now this kind of reverse discrimination that's taking place. So, yeah, it's very interesting. There's a concept here called intersectionality. I'm not sure if you know about this concept, but the idea that if you're a person who is a member in more than one oppressed or repressed group, you have a greater right to recompense, because now you are less privileged. You are truly less privileged. So for instance, if you're a woman, person of color, LGBTQ, has a disability, and you are a very intersectional person. And as a result, now you should be, in terms of compensation, awarded more. And because you have been historically much more oppressed. So the bottom bullet here says hiring. This is hiring for a job. The idea being that it no longer should be merit-based. And it could be hiring for a job, it could be school admissions too. But the idea is we're not going to make it merit-based anymore, because merit itself is a Western construct. It's this idea that you should be hired or you should be rewarded based on some performance. That is not that is not in keeping with cultures necessarily worldwide. That's a Western construct, and therefore it needs to be dismantled. So hiring now should instead be based maybe more on a lack of historical privilege, on intersectionality, or those other sorts of things that would qualify a person for that kind of oppressed kind of category. So. Tribalism and polar. This is a bit of a riff on what we talked about before in the media. But there's this idea that there's no such thing as objective truth anymore. There's no such thing as objective reporting anymore on anything. So what should I believe? And then if every institution is now biased and just reports their own narrative, which bias will I side with? Well, I'll side with the one who confirm my own biases and narrative. And so we see this nowadays more than ever. Everybody polarizes into their own tribe, which is basically people who believe like I believe. And so conservative, liberal, pro-Trump, anti-Polyev, whatever it is, you will go and you will basically kind of hang out online with, or, in your social group, those people who believe the same thing as you do, because we've given up now on this idea that there's an objective truth or an objective middle ground, because there isn't. So mainstream media, social media influencers run stories that they know will appeal to their camp. And, polarization continues to increase as a result. So it's very interesting. Question for you. Just a quick kind of trivia question. Do you know which demographic was the most likely to vote conservative in this past election? Anybody know? In Canada, in our recent election, which demographic was most likely to vote conservative? Do you know? High school can't vote, but yeah, if they could, maybe. Yeah. Close. So, men under 30, far more likely to vote conservative. Do you know who is most likely to vote liberal? Old people, pretty close. Yeah, women over 55. Yeah, baby boomers, there you go. Those boomers, what is it? But I can guarantee that those two groups are not hanging out in the same internet forums or listening to the same podcasts. They are very tribal in their view. And that's the kind of polarization we have nowadays. So, yeah. Cancel culture. So, if there's no such thing as an objective truth anymore, how can we debate an issue or win an argument? And the idea is, well, you actually really can't anymore, not in the traditional manner of presenting a case or assessing pros and cons. That's just not the way it works. Free speech is allowed, but debate is not possible. What's the best way to stop those who say unacceptable things? And basically the idea is just shutting them down. Just shouting them down and shutting them down. You impose a social ban on them by using internet and saying they did horrible things or said horrible things. If you can call them a label or name calling, like they're a racist or they're a bigot or whatever it happens to be, you can basically cancel them. And there's a picture of J.K. Rowling there, who, like I say, is a classic secular humanist, believes in feminism basically to the nth degree, but she has now been canceled as I think the term is TERF. Now, TERF, that's the term that gets used now. Trans exclusionary radical feminist, I think is the name. And if you're able to label somebody as a TERF, now you cancel them with a whole segment of left-leaning people. So, and so now this is the postmodern way of establishing what is right and wrong. It's not about breaking laws. It's not necessarily about debate. It's just about shouting loudly, being able to label them with something. Hopefully it sticks. And now it's kind of a mob way of enforcing justice. So anyhow. The next one, removing all sorts of speech and trying words, terms that would that are either perceived as being colonialist or Western civilization centric. We need to deconstruct and discard those terms because, from a listener's point of view, there's a perception that those things are potentially offensive or oppressive. Here's a list of some terms. This is from 4 years ago in CBC News that need to be discarded or at least considered to be discarded because they're rooted in Western oppression. Blackmail, blacklist, whitelist, black sheep, black mark. These are all racist terms. Spooky, sold down the river, master key, master bedroom. These are considered racist terms. Yes, I can see your quizzical look. Why would that be racist? But, think about it maybe more. Ghetto, inner city, first world problem. First world problem, this is a classist comment. Shouldn't use that term. Brainstorm, blindsided, blind spot. These are ableist terms. Dumb, lame, crippled, tone deaf, again, ableist. Savage, tribe, lowest on the totem pole, those are appropriationist or racist. And grandfathered in, that's a patriarchal term. There, of course, it's just a sample list. There are many, many other terms. And the idea here is that, we need, as part of this whole deconstruction project, to even look at our language and take a look at all of the roots of those languages and completely rebuild, remodel the language so that it doesn't have any of those constructs within it. And finally, it's about reimagining everything. And this is kind of the deconstruction project. What they had in mind in the beginning was that everything really that Western culture stands for has this kind of oppressive element to it or a discriminatory element to it. And so, and it's been built by Western males, so all of that, it's intrinsically, systemically, it's non-inclusive, and we need to dismantle it. So, again, here's some articles, and most of them are old, but they're, still timely. From USA Today is math racist. Debate rages over changes on how to teach the subject, or whether even if to teach the subject. Is economics a sexist science? To understand structural racism, look to our schools, and the idea being that schools themselves and the way in which things are taught, the manner in which it's taught, actually can be racist, because it's oftentimes, again, it's very lecture-oriented, or I'm going to give you facts, or those sorts of things, and different races may not be able to accommodate that very well. Capitalism and racism, conjoined twins. So this idea being that capitalism itself is just systemically, intrinsically racist, should be dismantled. And then addressing systemic racism against indigenous peoples in the justice system. And this kind of goes back to this idea that, the justice system itself, it is very based on kind of the English law code, the common code, back again during the Renaissance, and the idea being that, this idea of, you do something wrong and you get punished, this penal approach to justice, completely colonial and Western in its mindset. And how did indigenous people actually, enforce justice within them? And maybe we should be adopting that more of that type of system more. Needless to say, that's a school of thought that hasn't gotten very far yet, because there are so many ways that indigenous people did look at justice. So it's not gone very far. But the fact is that we believe in the deconstructionist mindset that our current justice system is oppressive. So. And same goes for democracy too, for that matter. Just about anything you can talk about government. So, final statements about this. So this is kind of a summary, and the idea here is, where we currently sit, deconstruction and postmodernism, call it the pinnacle of social and democratic development. The fact is, yes, it is now an acknowledgement that everyone has a voice, everyone has a truth, everyone's truth is valid, everyone's context is valid, everyone should be entitled to equality as a whole. I had another slide here about, parallels to Marxism, and I'm not going to get into that, but there are some parallels, and we can talk about that another time if we like. But the fact is this is, where we're currently at in Western society. However, despite the fact that it is this pinnacle, the roots back to this philosophical problem of sharing a common language or having just, a common understanding about terms that we use. Basically, this is kind of said, no, there's no way to have a common understanding around these terms. So rather than provide a solution to this problem of just common dialogue and understanding between people, it's instead unleashed a free-for-all. And it actually appears a little bit hopeless. Because it emphasizes an individual's subjective point of view and experience, it's inherently divisive, since everyone's point of view is different. And that's just the way it is. We all have a slightly different point of view. And if you emphasize everybody, you're right, and you're right, and you're right, and you're right, and we're all right, and never get to this place of, what is the real truth? Well, now you're just fomenting. You're encouraging divisiveness almost already right off the bat. There's no way of reconciling or mediating competing interests or viewpoints. One other thing here that's also a concern, it eschews personal responsibility. In other words, my truth, my reactions, they're conditioned by my historical context, and I have no choice to respond or perceive these things this way. I have no choice in the matter. It's my context and my circumstances that have made me this way. And as a result, I'm a bit of a victim almost, prisoner of my historical context, my genetics, where I grew up, how I grew up. This is where I'm at, and now I'm a prisoner. And my only way out is hopefully you realize that I'm oppressed and a prisoner, and you can compensate me for that. But this is what happens when, I'm no longer personally responsible. It's my context that has formed me and made me the way I am. It judges everything. Recent events and historical events, all events through the lens of my personal subjective perspective of today, and it judges the past while ignoring the context of the past. So, we view all of the things that happened in the past. We don't even think about the context. We just say, oh, that's horrible. And we label it as horrible. And this is why James Wolfe, his statue, he was a hero back in the day. He defeated the French, and a statue was erected. But in today's society, in our context, we view him as a person who was a colonialist. He was British. He came here and he fought against the French, but he was still a colonialist, and he enabled colonialism. And so we today view him as a colonialist. His statue should be torn down, and his statue should be defaced, and we should put sparrows all over his face because he was a bad person. And that kind of approach, which is basically this idea that, today, and our judgment of everything today is more important than any context in the past. I'm going to submit it's damaging. It's certainly part of our culture today, though. And then, maybe most importantly, the thing about postmodernism is, and the issue here is that it really does just ignore the practical reality of how the world works. The fact is 99% of the time, even though you might have a slightly different impression of something than me, it's not that much different. And we can agree on it. And we can pretty much agree on objective truth 99% of the time, even though we might slightly disagree in the details. We can basically agree. We can agree on a single account of events that occurred, and on facts. We can agree on those most of the time, most all of the time. And this is how we manage to talk with each other, understand each other, have meaningful dialogue. We use logic every day to deduce cause and effect and predict the future. All of these principles are yes, they're Western principles, but they work practically and in reality. And so with postmodernism, throwing out all of that has basically made for a bit of a free-for-all that doesn't allow for any acknowledgement of, things work. Objective truth and logic are essential to everyday life, and they work. And we can't just throw that all out, because the fact of the matter is that we rely on it every day. And so that's kind of a critique. Here's at the beginning of the presentation I said, recognize any of the terms? Well, now you know where the terms come from. Inclusivity, gender spectrum, diversity is our strength, etc. These things all come from postmodernism. Here's where we are. You can see I've added on one more box on the bottom, and this is postmodernism. You can't really necessarily read it, but we've talked about a lot of it. However, if you look at the left side of the diagram, and you look at, the Greek mythology, and there's a little cloud there, it says, many gods, many realities, no truth. That's where we came from 2,500 years ago. Derrida, which is over on the far right-hand side, there's a little cloud there under Derrida. It says, no God, many realities, many truths. And the idea there is, we haven't actually gotten very far. In some ways, we've come a little bit full circle. Derrida said that there's no God, and back in Greek mythology, there were many gods. But the many gods in Greek mythology were equated to no supreme God. So, it's not all that different. The fact is, too, Derrida would say, many stories and they're all valid. Many truths, they're all valid. Many truths and they're all valid. It's pretty much the same as the Greek side, which is, there's no such thing as truth. Well, we're pretty much there here, too. So the fact is that if you look at our 2,500-year progression, we've almost come around back to the beginning. Within this postmodern type of philosophy, you can see there's a lot of confusion, and the fact is that that has led to what we see today. I'll call it divisiveness, polarization, to a new level that we haven't seen in a long time, and so that's where we're at right now. Oh, no, that's it. Sorry. So the title of the presentation overall was How the West Was Lost, and I think I've managed to explain to you how the West was lost. The end. Yeah, goodbye. Yeah, no. So we do have one more session, and in that session we're going to talk about the Christian perspective, the Christian response to what we see in this world today. Right now, what we do see in this world, like I say, we have this huge influx of postmodernism. We still have a significant and strong current of secular humanism. How do we as Christians respond in that kind of world? What should our actions, our activities be, our behaviors? That's the subject of the next thing. And that one is the one that I'm probably most scared about, because this is actually maybe the most practical, the most, I'm not going to say contentious, but the fact is how we respond, how we act and interact with our society, especially in a polarized society like we live in today. I think Christians have the ability to make a profound and huge impact, but we do need to be sensitive to the culture we live in. And so it'll be an interesting session, if nothing else, and hopefully you come back for that. Thanks. Any questions, any final comments? Or? Yeah. Okay.
You talked about, I know it's just a stat that
Yeah.
are voting conservative. Do you have any theories as to why? It's, kind of thinking about it, they just see the dead end of kind of liberal, leftist, potentially woke kinds of ideas, and it's a response against that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Do they know why, or is it just a stat and we got to figure out?
It's a stat. No. Yeah, so that's a great question. Why are young men more likely to vote conservative? There's two reasons that have been, actually kind of proposed for that. But it's probably too early, but, I'll give you my opinion. One of the reasons is, they're the ones who are the most suppressed right now by this kind of ideology. Because, okay, you're a man, you're already privileged, and therefore, you need to, give up your job for this kind of minority or those sorts of things, or not get into school, etc. So there's this idea that they're the most suppressed by this kind of upheaval, upending of the old order, and that's why they must be voting that way, conservative, because they want to maintain. I will say that another theory is, and I think this is probably true, and I don't want to sound kind of sexist or anything like that, but it's very clear to me that men, because of the way in which society has kind of evolved over the past while, there are lots of questions that they have about their roles as provider, their roles as being protector, their role as being sort of the person who's the leader within a family. As well, it's also true that, males oftentimes gravitate more towards the hard sciences. And, now there seems to be kind of this move away from those hard sciences. So males are looking, especially young men, are looking for more of that structure, of that definition in their lives, of, their role and what they should be and how they should be. I think we see that too in, certain other phenomena. Like, so for instance, this idea that certain of these, call them secular humanists, who are very much, though, committed to objective truth and committed to this idea that, there are solid principles in life that you should live by. And so, for example, a Jordan Peterson. And how well that resonates with men in particular, and in particular young men. They attach themselves. This is it. These are principles to live by. This is how I think my life should go. And if I live by these principles, this is fulfilling my calling in life. I think that, and that's my opinion. This is why, we see this move of young men towards something that would be more conservative in nature. I read another stat about the Eastern Orthodox Church and a revival occurring within that church. And it's not, it could be within any church, but it was revival occurring within that church. And again, the recruitment was primarily young men who were they were immersing themselves, diving themselves into that. And they said because there's, again, so many practices within there, so much good structure around how you practice your faith. And they said, it's the people they interviewed, the young men they interviewed, it's, I just feel that this is the kind of thing that makes the faith more real to me. I've gone to evangelical services and their worship bands and everybody's, throwing their hands in the air and doing, but they said that to me is just an emotion. I want to get past that. I want to get to a real deep faith with meaningful principles in my life, and I think that I have to agree. I think that's something that young men are kind of in need of and longing for. So sorry, very long answer to should have been an easy question, but yeah.
It's ironic, isn't it, that all of this is only possible because of the incredible freedoms that our democracies shoot for and champion. And I remember listening to Russians, and I've heard it from others too in other parts of the world, that they just laugh and they say that it's only because of our freedoms that would never fly over here, over there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the very thing that they're jumping on top of to promote these ideas, if they actually get their ideas, then all that freedom will be taken away.
Yeah. And the idea that, democracy is eating itself. When you give everybody, an opinion and a voice, which democracy does, and in theory, there's a lot of good that comes from that. This idea, though, that not all of those voices are necessarily going to be valid, and a lot of those voices are actually going to be in conflict with each other. And how do you resolve that conflict if you can? Very, very profound moment in history, really, regarding democracy itself. Yeah. Sorry.
Thinking about phenomenon and people's subjective experience kind of truth. Was he just, how far did he go in his thinking? Because you can see how that kind of thinking, it makes sense in some ways for an individual. It's really not something you can build a society upon because there's no common values. Did he actually think that far, or was he more of just thinking about how do individuals experience things and not how, if you keep taking this further and further and say we need to build a society on this, which you really can't. I don't see how you could. Did he think that far, or was he just, he had the seeds of the ideas and then just morphed into something?
Yeah, I would say he was more, Derrida was more of a theorist than he was a practical philosopher. And so you're absolutely right. He did not think it through, and here's the new society we should build. He was much more about deconstruction as opposed to construction. And to be very fair, I don't feel like in my readings of certain postmodern philosophers, I haven't seen a very compelling vision about what the new construction would look like. Certainly the Frankfurt School, which was kind of very much the founder of critical theory and basically piggybacked off of Derrida's notions of deconstruction, they felt the ideal society was Marxist and complete egalitarian. And they viewed this dismantling of democracy and some of these other Western structures as being the first step towards somehow instituting more like a completely egalitarian, completely equal society. But I haven't read, anything that really talks about how you do that. Like, how do you get people to buy into that new world, the new world order? Same with critical race theorists. And there's lots about, how you need to dismantle all these oppressive structures, whether it be the judicial system or the legal system or all those sorts of things, and the economic system. But very little about, okay, well, what system do you put in place to replace that? It just doesn't seem to be there. It's, yeah. Mm. I completely agree. I completely agree. And I think that, like you say, when you talk about human nature and the profound understanding that, the original philosophers, and especially the Christian founders, had about human nature and what it was in, what was in it, and how it could be improved. You contrast that with, modern day philosophy, which is not at all about, for instance, sin, the fallen nature of man, man's tendencies, and how to overcome those tendencies that are bad. When you kind of kick God out of the equation, when you kick good and evil out of the equation, and really are talking more utilitarian terms about, well, this is good for most people and this is bad for most people. And getting angry is good sometimes, maybe not other times. And now you've got this very relativistic notion about, what is good, what is bad, and I totally agree. Philosophy in modern day terms is not about that at all. It's almost more about social movements. It's also more about, this idea of, how do you get people all kind of call it the imagine paradigm, where, living life in peace. Well, the first thing we need to do is just economically raise them to this place. And then, hopefully it all works out. And it's just wishful thinking. It's not really it's not profound at all from a human nature point of view. Yeah. These are really good questions. These are kind of tough questions too. No more questions for Dan. Anybody else have a Yeah, exactly. Just wait for the next session. Yeah. Okay, well, I guess that's it. Thanks, everyone. Yeah. And the next session is not next week. It's the following Thursday. So don't come here next week. Thanks.